Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to our session on food systems and people and the planet. It's great to have so many people registered for this event, and I hope you're having a good week. So my name is Tim Benton. I am Research Director at an international affairs think tank in London called Chatham House. My background has been a lifetime of working in universities thinking about sustainability and food systems. The way we're going to run this session is we're just going to go around the table, introduce ourselves. I'm going to say some framing about what the session is about, and then we will, each person in turn will give a 3 or 4 minute pitch about what they think is important, and then we'll have a discussion. So let's just go do our introductions. Kris, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you all are having a great conference. My name is Kris Nichols. I am a soil microbiologist by training. I have been working in regenerative agricultural systems in the United States primarily, have done some work in Australia and Canada as well, and working also with regenerative organic systems, trying to connect the soil with agriculture and food.
Thank you, Kris. Elaine.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here with you. My name is Elaine Evans, and I am an extension educator and researcher at the University of Minnesota, where I work in our bee lab. And I work on pollinators, working on encouraging pollinator habitat. I work especially with bees, mostly with wild bees, so not managed bees that we bring in to crops, but the bees that are living out all around us and are actually doing a good amount of the pollination. And pollinators are definitely impacted by climate and are an important part of a sustainable food system.
As no doubt we will come back to later. Alison, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Alison Blay-Palmer. I'm a professor in environmental studies and geography at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. And I'm also the UNESCO chair in food biodiversity and sustainability studies. And the work that we do at the center is really focused on developing food systems that help the people and the planet at the same time. Pollinators are part of that. Farming, sustainable farming is part of that. Soil is part of that. So it's really looking at everything together and how we can put all these pieces in one bowl and make them all synergistic.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in due course. Doniga.
Hi, everyone. My name is Donica Markigaard, and I'm here in coastal San Francisco Bay Area. And I am a regenerative rancher, and along with my family, we raise grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb, pasture-raised pork, and pasture-raised chicken. And we do this in a way that increases life both above and below ground. We work with a lot of soil scientists and wildlife biologists and bird biologists to show that we can actually farm and ranch with nature and increase biodiversity at the same time, building soil carbon and feeding people nutrient-dense, good, healthy, whole foods.
Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody. I'll just say a few words about what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. We've had an interesting range of buzzwords already: regenerative this, regenerative that, soil, microbiology, sustainable agriculture, pollinators, sustainable food systems, regenerative ranching. There are lots of things in this space that we need to do a little bit of unpacking. The title for the session is broadly food systems, and Alison mentioned the term food systems for people and the planet. And the food system is the system that encompasses people's eating of food, the production, the transport, the manufacturing, the processing of food, and the agriculture at the other end. And the reason it's a food system is that the market that determines what farmers grow is set by people's demand for the food, Farmers grow things that turn into food that people want to eat. So actually, if we want to think about how to make agriculture sustainable, we also have to think about how food and our demand for food enables or stops farmers from growing the things that would be sustainable in the broad sense. And the reason this is a very much a live topic is over the last 5 years or so, there has been a lot of academic research which, broadly speaking, indicates that food systems both drive a lot of unsustainable practices. They are one of the major drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, major driver of biodiversity loss, obviously undermine the utility of soils for storing carbon or nutrient cycling. We've lost a lot of pollinators that give rise to fruit that we eat. But also our food system, as well as driving all of these things around the planet from a negative perspective, our food system is also driving a global epidemic of ill health. Food and suboptimal diets are the major cause on a global basis of poor ill health and poor dietary health. So if we get our food system right to deliver healthy diets in a sustainable way, we're better off as people, and we're also much better off within the planet. So that's the kind of space that we're going to talk about today. I probably come to this from a more food systems end. I've been working a lot on nutrition and the dietary aspects of our food system over the last 5 years. And the other panelists come from this perhaps more from a agricultural end, and we'll try and integrate those sets of points as we go through the discussion. So we're now going to hand over in turn to each of the panelists to give a 3 or 4 minute pitch about what they think is important as a message to interest and introduce the field to you as the audience. So we're going to start off with Kris. Kris, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I very much agree with what you're talking about in agriculture. In order to be able to have the fundamental shift that we need to be having in the agricultural space to producing high quality food, we do need to have the markets existing there. And biodiversity is a big key, both biodiversity above ground and biodiversity below ground, that is going to be able to drive us having more nutrient dense food. And it also is going to help us to be able to have more high protein grains and other food as well, so that we're not just feeding empty carbohydrates to the populace. In much of the Western world, as you indicated, we're basically dealing with the twin dilemma of people suffering from obesity and malnutrition at the same time. And what research has been showing is that working with the soil and the soil microbial community, regenerating the soil, truly is going to be the way in which we're going to be able to get the nutrient dense food that we need. In many cases, the amino acids and some of the antioxidants that we need to get from our food as animals. So even the animals that we may be consuming that Doniga produces need to get this from their forage, is that comes from the microbial community, either directly or indirectly. These amino acids and antioxidants are formed by the microbial community. So in order for that to get into our food chain, we need to be able to have these microbes as a major component of that. And what we want to do, one of the key things that I've been working on in discussing with farmers and ranchers, as well as with consumers, is the idea of treating the soil like we're supposed to be treating ourselves. In order to be healthy organisms, how do we make sure that we are, consuming small meals throughout the day, which means, being able to get food into the soil, and the food comes from photosynthetic activity. It comes from having plants. So utilizing innovative tools in order to be able to get new plants, and in some cases not new plants, but indigenous plants back growing on our landscape, so that we can be able to utilize different types of plants and extend the growing seasons in order to be able to incorporate things like perennials and annuals together, in order to be incorporating perennial, in order to incorporating polycropping, relay cropping, double cropping, even in northern climates and even in as far north as the UK. Can we have multiple growing seasons there, sometimes multiple cash crop growing seasons, as well as, you know, having cover crops and companion crops. So looking at these innovative tools to actually figure out ways to get plants growing for a longer period of time and harvesting sunlight so we can get more photosynthetic activity feeding the soil microbial community. That's automatically going to add biodiversity because we're looking for different plants that are going to be growing in different times throughout the year, and that's going to enhance pollinator health, and it's going to enhance the quality of the food products that are being produced and different forages to feed the animals. So it's all interrelated and interwoven in a very nice way. And then the other thing that we need to do, again, focusing on ourselves as treating the soil like ourselves. So we're going to eat small meals throughout the day. We're going to put carbon in the soil more. We're going to have the diversity that's going to be there, the diverse diet. We need to exercise. And exercise, when we're looking in agricultural systems, is to be putting some, allowing for some stressors to happen. And that's one of the things, the big things that I don't think we've allowed enough to occur in Western agriculture is we don't allow for some stressors to happen. The plants will function better and they'll work more with the microbial community when there is a little bit of nutrient stress. That allows them to give off more exudates and funnel that to the microbial community. When there may be some water stress, but also really importantly, when you have some pest stresses, especially insect pest stresses, that's going to be able to drive some of the formation of these antioxidants and polyphenolics that help reinforce the wall structure of the plant cells themselves. And that's what we're missing from our food is we don't get that stress. We're not exercising the plants. We're not making the plants work. We're instead looking at what the plants we think the plants need and giving them what they need without them having to put any effort in. And you're not going to have a healthy soil or a healthy plant. No organism is healthy without having a little bit of stress. You know, and I know Doniga has that incorporated in the way that she manages the animals. You don't stress to injury, but you have a little bit of stress that's part of it. And then the other thing for us too is we want to protect, you have to protect your skin, which is your largest organ. We protect our skin in multiple ways with clothing and sunscreen and other things like that. The plants, the soil surface needs to be protected with living plants and crop residues. So I think that's an important component to go for.
Thank you very much, Kris. Lots of food for thought there. Elaine, over to you.
Hi, so I am going to build up. That's a great perspective. I love diving deep into the tiny things, how important the microbes are. I'm going to build up a little bit from that to a scale up from that to little tiny insects that are doing so much for our food supply and our planet in general. So plants are need their pollen to move around. A lot of them do it from wind and things like that. A lot of our staple crops are actually wind pollinated, but it's 80% of flowering plants that depend on animals to move pollen between plants so that those plants can reproduce, so they can produce seeds and fruits and survive. And most of those animals are bees and other insects. And that the kind of bigger picture, starting out from that zoomed out thing, that 80% of plants, this is this huge impact on our ecosystem. So those plants are filtering our water. They're helping build soils. So it's not just our food that pollinators are helping. We need to make sure that we're supporting these pollinators so we can keep this big system working. When it comes to our food, it's about a third of our diet, about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that a typical person eats, that can be traced back to the impact of those animal pollinators. And that is not just the fruits and nuts that we eat, but also their pollinating forage that's used for animals, that's used to produce dairy, all kinds of different impacts. a really important thing about that 1/3 is that those are a lot of our really nutrient dense foods. So those fruits and nuts that are packed with the antioxidants that Kris was talking about, that microbes are important for, pollinators are important for those too. So really making sure that we have a really nutritious food supply is dependent on having those healthy pollinators. And the healthy pollinators are dependent on having a system that is supporting them. So there's lots of things we can do just with natural habitat for pollinators, but with so much of our landscape in agriculture, we can't ignore the need for pollinator habitat in agricultural systems too. I mentioned, not all those crops are dependent on pollinators, but we need to think about pollinators even when they're not directly connected with the crop that's right there. We need to have habitat that's there to support them, that is protected from pesticides, which include both insecticides and fungicides, are all impacting pollinators. Those kind of habitats that can support pollinators will also be supporting a whole bunch of other insects that are going to be important too. So there's a lot of natural enemies of pests that would be in the crops that can be supported by these same kind of habitats that are supporting pollinators. So, I focus on bees, I focus on pollinators, but it's part of what's exciting about that work is because it does connect to all these other things. It connects to other beneficial insects. It connects to soil health, to our food systems. And so, it's one little piece of a big picture, but it's an important piece for us to keep in mind.
Mute again. Thank you very much, Elaine. That was brilliant and very passionate. Alison, over to you for your pitch.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm really glad to get to speak to so many students. This is a wonderful opportunity, especially as an educator. I love doing this, so thanks for having me. I think the perspective, I'm going to go up even further beyond what Kris and Elaine were talking about, and maybe be a linking point with Doniga's amazing work, and talk about the food system. And Tim mentioned at the beginning in his introduction that there is a food system that goes all the way from field to fork. So all the way from the farmer through distribution, retail, marketing, and all that kind of stuff to the eater and then to the waste heap. That's part of the food system. But the food system also includes all the environmental, the financial, so the economic, and the cultural, social dimensions that are associated with food. So it's not just calories, it is very important as a nourishing thing, but it's other things beyond that. And there's a few points within that bigger food systems picture that I would like to make. So the first thing is to do a bit of myth busting. So there seems to be an impression that we don't have enough food to feed everybody in the world. That in fact is not correct. We have more than enough food to feed everybody right now, plus going up to 10 billion people if we need to, a healthy diet. The challenge is that even though right now, and despite that, we have 820 million people who are food insecure. So the problem is not having enough food to feed people. The problem is getting food to people and people being able to afford healthy diets. So being able to get the kind of food that Doniga produces and the kind of food that includes pollinator habitats and includes healthy soils, that's what we're talking about here. Another thing that's important, and as Tim mentioned, 37% of greenhouse gases are attributable to the globalized food system. This includes deforestation, it includes chemical use, it includes transportation and food waste. There's also a huge amount of soil loss from our current monoculture kind of food system that denudes fields, or even if they're engaged in more sustainable technologies, they still leave soil open and it blows away, and our arable soil is disappearing. We lose about 70 billion tons every year, and that costs us about $400 billion US annually. In terms of biodiversity, which Elaine spoke to very effectively, monocultures are not healthy. So there are ways of farming that include biodiverse farming systems, and then also nurture pollinators. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can do both. So at the moment, about $577 billion in crops are at risk due to pollinator loss every year. And this results in a 23% decrease in food productivity. So the cost is huge. Now, what are some of the solutions? Some of the solutions are adopting a more agroecological. So this is a community-based approach to food systems that's integrative, that's closed loop, and also other kinds of sustainable farming and ranching systems. These kinds of systems can be supported by developing online training and knowledge sharing that would require reduced bandwidth, so people in the global south would be able to use these kinds of systems. There's also opportunities for food distribution. So one of the things that we've seen through the COVID crisis is a turning of people in the global north and the global south to using online distribution systems to directly connect consumers with producers. So these more localized food systems. And there's also, what's really important is protecting the land rights of farmers, the people who produce our food, and allowing them to own their land. And in this case, blockchain technologies can be really advantageous for developing systems that allow people to have their land tenure given to them in perpetuity. So there are lots of innovations. They don't have to be innovating in terms of making, you know, better burgers that are all pulse-based or something. That's not going to help us because those are monocrop kinds of systems. What we need are sustainable food systems that give us the protein, that give us the healthy food, and do it in a way, they do it in a way, I guess my time is up, do it in a way that's good for people and the planet and communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Great timing. You answered a lot of the questions that I think are fundamental to, or you addressed some of the questions that are fundamental to this session, and we will probably come back to many of the points that you've raised in a couple of minutes. So last but not least, Doniga, do you want to give your 3, 4, 5 minute pitch?
Yeah, so that was a lot of information and I'd like to invite all of you across the globe on a little journey. So I'm going to invite you just to close your eyes for a minute and imagine that you're joining me in the middle of the wilderness, in the largest tract of wilderness in the United States, where I spent 7 summers tracking wolves. And I followed an alpha wolf on a journey, and that wolf brought me to an incredible meadow ecosystem where there was just so much life. And if you take in this life with all of your senses, imagine the smells and the feel of the breeze and the cool stream going through this meadow and the sounds of the sandhill cranes migrating overhead. And you come across a large bull elk partially submerged in the water that had just been taken down by a pack of wolves. And then as you're there in the middle of this meadow, imagine the wolves howling all around you. And all of this life is working together. And the wolves, the predators, they're moving the prey. They're moving the wolves from meadow to meadow. And that herd had moved on, and the wolves had made that meadow their rendezvous site. So the pups were playing and play hunting and feeding on this incredible nutrient dense organ meat of this elk. And the life, it was like a dance. It was rejoicing with that movement. So the predators were moving the prey, these large herds of elk, which moved across the landscape. And then that in turn moved the plants. And those plants, because they were eaten, they were trampled, they were urinated on, they were fertilized through the manure of the elk and all the other life. There was diversity. There was so many different plants and flowers and trees and so much life that fed this intact wilderness system. And then those plants, that diversity of those plants, then moved the soil through their roots and through the mycelial network, the underground. So by the predators moving the prey and the prey moving the plants and the plants moving the soil, carbon is drawn down into the soil. So then imagine that you're in a ranch or a farm, and instead of wolves, there's humans, and the humans are moving the animals, and they might be herds of cattle or sheep. And then those animals are then trampling and eating those plants. And then those plants are moving the soil. So that is my role as a regenerative rancher, is I move the animals because nature moves and we are a part of nature. And if we don't move nature, if we don't participate in that dance, then nature will find ways to move. And that might result in out of control fires like we just experienced here in California, because we as humans didn't take our place as tenders of the wild. And we didn't move all of that vegetation that was built up over time. We instead removed the large herds of animals that would have moved that vegetation through their bodies and into the soil. So then nature comes along with lightning and decides to move it herself. And that results in catastrophe for us. So what part of the movement can you participate in? How can you move? How can you move your body and participate in the health of yourself and the health of the planet and the health of the people around you? And that's what I like to define regenerative agriculture as, is we're part of a movement to move our bodies in relation to all life. And so we can then, as a result, increase that life.
Brilliant. What an interesting and inspiring set of comments. Now, we've got about 15 or so minutes to have a discussion. And what I'm going to just do is throw out some questions, and then if you just wave if you want to answer them. The first question I want to ask is, at the moment, 75% of the world's calories come from 8 crops. 50% of the world's calories come from 3 crops: wheat, rice, and maize. And the other 5, if I can remember them, are palm oil, soya, sugar, potatoes, and barley. So that's the 8 that gives us 75% of the world's calories. If we are going to have a regenerative agricultural system that provides better for the planet and provides healthy diets, the first question is, what should we grow? And including in that livestock, not just crop plants. So who wants to tackle that one? Because at the moment, we grow far too much of far too few things. Right, Kris waved first and then Alison.
So yeah, I mean, I think first off, we should pretty much grow everything. I'm not gonna say that, because 8 crops is way too little, and we know that it's way too little. And when we're looking again at diversity within grains, and the story that Doniga took us on, the journey that Doniga took us on, is that nature has this incredible diversity that somehow we as species that are not the dominant species as far as I think intelligence or other things like that, but the dominant species as far as numbers on this planet, and our impact, I should say, on this planet, that we need to look to nature, to everything that it is that we can get food from. diversity in grains. We look a lot of times at grains as providing mostly carbohydrates, but they can provide us with high protein. Quinoa, I think, is a great grain that is growing in popularity, but also looking at other grains, looking at other legumes beyond soya. That oftentimes when I talk to farmers and ranchers, one of the things that I'll point out is, from a natural standpoint, you probably couldn't have picked worse grain to pick than maize, and you probably couldn't have, as far as the cost that maize has on the ecosystem. There is no worse grain that you could have picked to be a dominant grain. And as far as legumes are concerned, you couldn't have picked a worse legume than soya as far as its efficiency of conversion to protein. So, and again, it's ecological cost. So we picked dominant things that actually aren't the most efficient. And so a lot of times when I take this journey through nature, I'm taking a journey through nature where I'm looking at what we need to do is maximizing the efficiencies of the system. And so looking for the grains and the legumes and the oil seeds and the diverse crops that we can have, as well as the diverse animals that we can have in the system for consumption, that are going to be able to maximize efficiencies.
Thank you, Kris. I read a paper recently that did a survey in India, and they recorded 1,750 or something different sorts of crops or wild plants that were regularly eaten. So that compares to the 8 crops that provide the bulk of the world's food supply. Alison, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, please, thanks. I think it's also important to recognize that the more diversity we have in our food system, the more diversity we have in our ecosystems. And also the more diversity we have within crops, the more resilient tools we have to build adaptive crops to climate change. So if we only have, I mean, if you look at the chicken, for example, the farm chickens in North America, you can boil it all down to almost one genetic source. And when you have so little genetic variation, the crops and the animals that we tend to rely on puts our whole food system across the world in jeopardy. Whereas if we have diversity, then in that case, we are able to be more adaptive and more resilient overall. So Tim, your point is bang on. We need to really build this up and do it in a way that that the benefits, and that's the beauty of food, right? Is if we have communities that are benefiting and people, and we're developing things using indigenous knowledges as well. There's huge knowledges. Those will help pollinator systems. They'll help more ecological farming, and they'll help build better soils. So it's all of a piece. It's hard to pick it apart.
Great, and I think I'd say from a nutritional perspective, and we put this in a recent IPCC report, to a first approximation, a healthy diet, one that is rich in plant proteins, diverse plants, whole grains, relatively small amounts but important amounts of livestock produce, etc. A diet like that is also a more sustainable diet, so it's better for biodiversity and better for many things and better for us. Okay, my next question, looking nervously at the watch with 10 minutes to go, is, okay, we should grow a diverse system. The next question is, how should we grow things? Now, we've already had regenerative, we've had sustainable, we've had a whole range of different things. I'm not sure if anybody's mentioned the word organic yet, but I'm sure that's going to come up. And we have the reality that the bulk of the world's production, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, is highly intensively industrialized farming systems. So if we're going to grow a diversity of crops, how should we grow them? Who wants to tackle that one? Doniga.
Great. So we've been talking about looking to nature to find those solutions. And I encourage all of you students out there to do that and to really immerse in natural systems and get to know your place and how these natural cycles function. So, going back to my story, there is no ecologically intact ecosystem that's devoid of animals. So there should be no ecological regenerative agriculture system that's devoid of animals. And you can say that about insects as well. We should not grow food devoid of insects and pollinators and birds and all of this life. So, where I focus on is we're on 11,000 acres of coastal terrace prairie grassland. And that's a native ecosystem. We're working with a lot of native plants. We don't plant a single seed, and we have 137 species of plants on just one of the ranches that we graze. So it doesn't, we kind of can think outside the box, and we can grow things everywhere. And the great thing about growing things everywhere is that everything you grow is drawing down carbon. So that's being part of the solution. So we need to have everything green for as long as possible. And that includes urban areas, that includes, every possible place you can be growing things, you should be growing things. And where you can integrate livestock, do that and bring in holistic ranchers that are in touch with their place and their ecosystem so that we can observe and we can interact, because we need that knowledge. And so much of that knowledge of place, that indigenous knowledge, is just holding on by a thread. But let's hold on to that thread and expand it. We shouldn't just say, oh, that knowledge, is barely there. Well, let's say, okay, what knowledge is there? And it's place-based. And let's find those people, those elders that have that knowledge, and honor them and lift them up and bring them to the forefront as our mentors and as our teachers. And so that's where, where we should be focusing, is we should be growing everything everywhere and integrate those animals and those insects and, ranch in nature's image.
I love that image. We should be growing everything everywhere. Elaine, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I've just got a quick little thing to put in here in terms of how to grow and how to increase efficiency for those for crops that are both dependent on pollinators and those that aren't. You can increase the efficiency of those crops, increase the production by actually putting some of that crop area into a natural habitat, into a habitat that would support pollinators and beneficial insects. So, we're looking at, every person that's growing has a limited amount of land that they have, but having up to, a third of that in more natural habitat doesn't sacrifice the yield that you're getting. You get the same amount of yield because you're increasing the efficiency and the ability of those crops to function better.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. I just want to throw the curveball in then. Agroecological approaches would typically, and that's not always the case, particularly with things like mob grazing, agroecological approaches would typically produce lower yields. If we're growing more diverse systems, diverse farming systems, we would lose some economies of scale. And our food system at the moment, or our agricultural production, is predicated on absolute intensive production to maximize productivity. If we're doing things from a more nature-friendly perspective and a more diverse perspective, that implies that we're growing different things in different ways, changing availability. It will impact on changing prices. Calories will become more expensive, potentially. Nice ranch-fed beef will become much more expensive than very intensive feeding lot type intensive systems, how do we manage this transition towards a wholesome food system that produces better food, better for us, better for the planet, but will typically be more expensive? Certainly from my perspective, with a third of food wasted, it's economically rational to waste food because it's so freely available for many families around the world. Perhaps having more expensive food that makes us think more about the food that we're buying won't be a bad thing. We could spend more money on an item of food, but less money on food in general because we don't waste food. So how do we get out of this bind that we've got a food system that is specialized at producing as much food as possible, as cheaply as possible, when all the things that we're saying are likely to make food differentially available and differently priced? Kris had her hand up first.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think that there are several points that I want to slightly disagree with you, Tim, on. And one is that the systems can't produce as much as the current systems that we have. I don't want us to get, I think that part of what we do is we get bogged down in language, and regenerative and organic and agroecological types of systems are systems in which we're afraid, and we put labels on them, and all of that processing costs money. And so, when you're thinking about all of that, putting a label on it, creating a standard, all of those types of things cost money. And so that can change, sort of the economies that are going to be happening here. So I would say one is that they don't automatically yield less. And especially if we're looking at one of the things that I want to be talking about and really emphasizing is that I think our current systems are lazy. They're not efficient. They're not intensive. They're not, even though, you may put those words to them, what we're looking at in regenerative systems are really intensive agroecological systems. We're going to intensify the system where we are going to be growing things like double cropping, relay cropping. So you're growing multiple crops in a season where normally we're saying we're going to grow one crop. And we're going to be growing those multiple crops even in areas like the global north, in the UK and in Canada and other places. We can grow multiple crops in a season. And so that is, as we do that intensification, even though one single crop may yield a little bit less, because we're doing that, overall, we're actually going to be producing more. And because we're going to be integrating animals into the system as well, that's also going to be producing more. So one, I think that there's a lot of arguments that even, the yield of one single crop in an agroecological, regenerative, or organic system would yield less. I think we could argue that, but the other thing is that just overall, I think we're going to be producing more as we look at how we're going to intensify the system. And again, if we're going to want to produce more, that is that efficiencies and the intensity that's actually going to allow that to happen. And the other thing is when it comes to cost, and I know, we're running out of time, but when it comes to cost, we don't pay the true cost of what we call cheap food. And if we were to change the system in which we paid the true cost of food production for all of the types of food you produce, whether it is regenerative or organic or agroecological or utilizing a conventional chemical paradigm, if we actually put the true cost of food, the cheapest food on the market would be food that is produced utilizing agroecological practices.
Okay, I'm going to pass to Alison for a 30-second answer to this question because we have only got 1 minute left. And then I want everybody to think of a 30-second answer to my final question is, what can everybody who's watching this session do to make a food system better? So Alison, over to you about that price availability.
I think that exactly, we need to internalize all the costs associated with every food system. What Kris said was bang on. And I think we also have to think about the global north and the global south, because the solutions are not necessarily the same. And I think that here we're pretty much talking about the global north. So I would challenge students, if I can have my 30 seconds now, I would challenge students to think about equity in the food system, about food access to good quality, healthy food that's culturally appropriate and that doesn't damage the planet in any way, and that will make the planet a better place, because food can do that. It isn't doing that now, but it can do that. It can sequester carbon, it can clean up the waterways. It can create biodiversity. It can feed healthy food. It can do all those things. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. That was my timer going off, as you probably heard. Elaine, you're next on my screen. Your 30-second pitch, what should the students do? You're on mute.
I'm going to go a little bit broader, and definitely there's lots we can do with sustainable agriculture, with food justice. We also need to just keep our eye on the prize with working on climate. So keep working on supporting regulations that are going to help us bring our climate damage down to where we need to be.
Thank you. Doniga.
Okay, I'm gonna say grow your own personal soil, increase your gut microbiome, grow something in soil that you can touch, wash your hands in healthy dirt, and get to know soil savvy farmers and ranchers and their practices, how they do things, and support them.
Kris, almost final word to you.
So I've got 2 almost final words here, and one of them is, if you look at this, if you look at this team, we have 4 brilliant women. And that is the thing that I think we need to focus on. A lot of times when we focus on agriculture, it's focusing on solutions that we get from men. And I apologize, Tim, but agriculture is dominated globally by women. Women are the farmers and ranchers. And so, listening to the knowledge that comes from women. And the other thing that I want to just read off a quote here, that's one of my favorite quotes to talk about from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And if we take that approach, I think we're going to be able to solve the climate issues we have, the water issues that we have, and the food and health issues that we have.
Right, well, on that note, I will just say my final bullet point to people watching this is think about what you're eating, both for your diet and your health, but perhaps most importantly for the planet. And if we're more deliberative about our choices, then we can drive the system in the right way. So there's a role for everybody living in urban centres and living in the countryside and everywhere in between. Right, well, thanks very much, everybody on the panel for being such a brilliant set of interesting commentators. And I hope you watching this have had a good session, and good luck with the rest of the conference, and good luck with your studies. Okay, au revoir, everybody.